What's up, everyone? True Techno Gamer here, back at it. Now let's get back to some gaming talk. It's been some interesting developments as of late. PS5 Pro, once again, rumors are heating up. It sounds like it's a real thing. I've talked about this a lot already on my channel. And, there was some little tidbits of spec information that kind of really solidifies the picture of what this thing can look like. We got tentative dates. We got the project code name from seemingly credible sources. So things are really starting to heat up. So I'm going to touch on some of the new developments, put the whole thing together, and then kind of look at what the overall performance profile can be, can look like for this thing. Some people have some vastly unrealistic expectations. If you understand how computer hardware works and how development happens and timing on everything and kind of just where we're at in terms of laws of diminishing returns and manufacturing processes, et cetera, it's not really hard to see what this thing could be. There's some bits and pieces that are coming together from AMD's roadmap, and I think we have a pretty good idea. So you really shouldn't be surprised when you see this thing, hopefully in 2024. If you follow the channel, it should all make sense. So let's start talking about it right now. All right, now let's get into this latest PS5 Pro developments. This latest flurry of information kind of started roughly a month ago. I think it was sometime in June. There was a new article and some new information coming from Tom Henderson. Tom Henderson runs a website called Insider Gaming, and he's pretty credible leaker. He's an industry insider, claims to have some contacts, but he's the one that leaked information about Sony's Project Q, the handheld PS5, which turned out to be real, as we know. And he also released a bunch of information previously about PS5 hardware, et cetera. So pretty credible source, but at the same time, grain of salt, of course. This stuff isn't confirmed, obviously, by Sony themselves, but it still kind of corroborates with a lot of the earlier rumors and leaks that, we had already talked about over the past year or so. So this is another site that actually I believe is run by Tom Henderson. It's called keytogaming.com. It has a summary of the information here. It's kind of hard to discern, so I'm going to show this site from VG Leaks, which basically summarizes the information that we got out of this latest leak. Now, we're going to take a look at it, but let's recap what we think we know about the PS5 Pro so far. Now, we've heard, and I've shown this before in several videos, but there's been leaks pointing to some obvious high-level spec targets. Generally speaking, it seems like Sony is aiming for a 2x increase in overall graphical horsepower, and about 2.5x increase in ray tracing performance. So obviously there's an extra focus on ray tracing, getting ray tracing performance up, but we're looking at least a 2x increase. And I think if you understand, what's happening with computer manufacturing and laws of physics, that's probably the most realistic estimate we can get on the high end. In terms of what's possible in 2024 for the price point of a console, $500 or so, within the form factor of a console, right? You could always throw more stuff in there, but you're going to need a much bigger chassis and much more heating, much louder fans, stuff like that. And then the price, of course, goes way up. So you have to understand there are a lot of physical limitations when you're thinking about building a console. You can't throw a 4090 or 7900 XTX into a console. Not going to happen. Over time, the technology and the capability of a 4090 will shrink in size and in power. So not to say in 5 years from now, you couldn't have a 4090 in what could be a PS6, but today it's way too big and way too power hungry and generates way too much heat to ever think about fitting in a console. So we have to understand what the limitations are here. So we're going to keep that in mind, right? That 2x, we heard about that 2x increase in graphical horsepower is the target. We've heard rumors suggesting that the CPU will move up to probably a Zen 4 architecture. Zen 4 would be the 7000 series. So we went from 3000 series, which is Zen 2, and then 5000 series with Zen 3, and then 7000 series with Zen 4. By the time this system comes out, of course, there will be a Zen 5, but it'll probably be two too close to the launch for Sony to really think about putting it into the console. Again, whatever the PS5 Pro is going to be, it pretty much is almost finalized right now in 2023. In fact, we'll see that, and you probably already can see ahead, that some of the information from Tom Henderson's leak of late points to some specific details of the system. So PS5 Pro is codenamed Trinity, so we got a code name that seems to make sense because Sony seems to love the Matrix. So most of the system code names are related to the Matrix. PS4 Pro was Neo, PSVR 2 was Morpheus, so Trinity makes sense. It's been in development since early 2022. That also seems to make sense in general time frame. Early 2022, it releasing target late 2024. Down here it says development is in development and targeting November 2024. November is the general release for most consoles releases as of late. Kind of makes sense, right? About 2.5 years, almost 3 years time. Let's see. They already mentioned that demo events are already happening for developers right now. That's pretty interesting. So again, the hardware has to be generally pretty close to being finalized. Majority of studios will receive dev kits this year by late November. So again, that's kind of what would be necessary to get this thing out by next year. Now, here's where it gets interesting. So sources have stated PS5 Pro / Trinity features 30 WGP and 18,000 MTS in memory. Now, I know you guys may not know what that means, and it's explained some of it here. The 30 WGP, those are worker groups, AMD language, would mean 60 compute units for the GPU. The current PS5 has 36 active. Okay, well, I'm going to go into this probably more, but active is the key word here. The total number of compute units on the PS5 GPU is actually 40, but 4 of them were disabled for higher yields. As consoles are mass produced, you're talking about millions and millions, tens of millions of units that have to be produced. When you manufacture the chipset kind of comes out of production. It's on a wafer. And of course, during the manufacturing process, not all of them are going to be perfect. There are always defects. If you need a certain number of CUs you have to have in order to use that chip, if you reduce that number, it means that you can use more chips off the assembly line, so to speak. So if you say we only need 36, that means that up to 4 of them could have issues, could have defects, and they can be disabled. They will be disabled, and then you still have your PS5 GPU, right? If you said you needed 40, you're going to be able to use a lot less, so it's going to be slower to manufacture. That's what this is all about. Now, granted, a PS5 Pro would probably not be as high number of production. It's only going to be a fraction of the overall PS5 sales. So maybe they can afford a little bit less yields. We don't know, obviously, right now. But needless to say, what I'm saying is the 60 compute unit number is the total number most likely. And it's possible that the active number in the final system would be less than that. 56 or 54, depending on how many numbers CUs they need to disable. It'd be great if they can keep them all active, but based on the precedent, they probably will have to disable. We just don't know. It also shows here PS5 Pro will be targeting improved and consistent FPS at 4K resolution. Better performance. That's what all that's saying. Interestingly, a new performance mode for 8K resolution and then accelerated ray tracing, which we talked about before. Now, this new performance mode for 8K resolution, I suspect to be similar to what I've talked about already before on my channel. Sony seems to be working on some kind of system level reconstruction technique that can basically upscale or up-res, games to a certain target resolution. Maybe they have some way to do that and basically can reconstruct 8K resolution with the lower, using less resources kind of thing. Kind of similar to what DLSS and FSR does. But something that Sony may come up with at a system level. I highlighted before in my video that there was a number of Sony patents that talked about doing exactly that. So it wouldn't be entirely surprising. 8K isn't very compelling, honestly. And 8K is probably still too much to do natively. But, at least they can say, hey, we have 8K on the box and it is meaningful. So we'll see. Accelerated ray tracing is probably the biggest, I think, performance need for the consoles. The PC is quite a bit ahead in terms of being able to output ray tracing effects and stuff like that, and with relatively good performance. So the more they can do with that, the better, for sure. So yeah, I mean, so there's some interesting nuggets of information there. Now, again, keeping this in line with the whole 2x target and 2.5x target is kind of like the reference point here, right? Now, notice they don't mention anything here about the CPU at all. So all we have to go off, there was previous leaks that talked about Sony can probably move up to a Zen 4 CPU, coming from a Zen 2. On the CPU side, every generation of CPU has had IPC gains or instructions per clock. That means essentially that if you had the two generations of CPU at the same clock speed, you still would have better performance with the higher one based on the IPC gains. So could that combine with the, would probably be some kind of a clock increase as well on the CPU side? We don't know, but needless to say, we probably will see somewhere on the order of 30% to up to 50% maybe improvement on the CPU side, which is a nice bump. And the CPUs kind of don't go up that high. I mean, the IPC gains we're usually talking about is like 15% gen on gen. So that's like 2 years. We might see a 15%, maybe 20% on the upper end IPC increase. So this will be going up 2 generations. So combined, we're probably looking at something more than 30% right there. And then if it's, depending on what the clock speed look like, we can be looking at anywhere, who knows, but go from 3.5 gigahertz, which it is today on the PS5. If they can get that up to 3.7, 3.8, that's a meaningful increase, about 10%. So there you go. Almost 50%. That's probably around the best case we can expect for the CPU, by the way. But there's no information here. I'll keep you guys posted if more credible information comes out. But now, looking at more of the GPU and the memory bandwidth, right? So that 18,000 MTS is more about the memory bandwidth. So what does that really look like? How can we interpret that looking at PC hardware that we know of today? And will that help Sony get to that 2x target? Is it a realistic target? Well, let's take a step back for a minute. Now, I'm going to be using a website called Tech Power Up, if you haven't heard of it. I've used this before on my channel. It's a really popular website, but they're really awesome. They have a GPU database that pretty much has like every GPU out there. It even has console GPUs, but they really focus on a lot of desktop CPUs. So we'll talk about that in a second. But it has like great details on the specs. It has some description. It has a really good outline of all basically the key specs you would care about for a GPU. And then on the PC side, as well, I'll show here, they have a relative performance, which is great. So you can literally look at a GPU and then kind of see where it fits relative to other GPUs that are near it. So we're going to definitely be looking at this, and I'm going to break down what these leaks suggest. So let's go back first and just look at the PS5 GPU here. So what do we know? In terms of the compute units, as we just talked about, the current PS5 has 36 active compute units. And it runs with a GPU clock speed of about 2.2 gigahertz, which is pretty fast for a console. The memory clock here is 14 gigabytes per second effective, and that equals roughly 1750 megahertz, okay, for the GPU. So what does that mean? Well, the render config here, combined with the clock speed, is how you compute your teraflops. So the teraflops here, as we know for the PS5 currently, is rated at about 10.3. Let's just generally ballpark it and say 10. The memory bandwidth right now is 448 gigabytes per second. That's on a 256-bit bus. You don't have to know what that is, but just keep that number in mind. That's with these memory clocks. That's what you get, 448. Now, 2 times the general compute power, of course, pretty easily in this case, would generally be about 20 teraflops. That's what we would want to see. And this is what we care about, this FP32. That's the 32-bit float. We would want to see something that's roughly 20 teraflops to get to our 2 times increase, right? And then we want 2.5 times increase in ray tracing performance, right? So we'll talk about how we get there. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is the architecture here. So the PS5 is currently based on AMD's RDNA 2.0 architecture. Now, the latest AMD cards are on RDNA 3.0 architecture. And one of the benefits for RDNA 3.0 is that right off the bat, you get a 50% increase in performance per watt. So that means that if you had the same amount of power, like literal power, electricity, right, to an RDNA 3 card, even if it had the same render configuration, same number of cores, same clock speed, etc. But just on this, with the same power envelope, in theory, you can get up to 50% more performance within the same power envelope. That's what that means. The second thing we know about RDNA 3, though, is that they added some what they call ray trace accelerators, and those increase the ray tracing performance and efficiency. According to AMD, up to roughly 50% over RDNA 2, 50%. So again, same number of cores, same number of compute units. On RDNA 3, you can get roughly 50% more ray tracing performance. So notice when Sony said 2 times compute and 2.5 for ray tracing. So there's your 0.5 for ray tracing, hint, hint. Now, what does the PS5 GPU look like on the PC side? So we can kind of get some perspective here on what level of performance we're looking at now and what our 2 times increased performance will look like, okay? To see the answer there, we have to look at what AMD calls the RX 6700. Now, the RX 6700 is an interesting GPU. It technically is a card by AMD. It technically exists, but I believe it's only had limited releases in certain markets around the world. It's not something that you would generally find readily available everywhere for some reason. They have an RX 6700 XT that's readily available, and then they have an RX 6600 XT that's readily available, but the 6700 for some reason is not. But when you look at the specs, you even see it up here. This is as close, it literally is a match for the exact PS5 configuration, okay? So again, let's look at some of the details here. Render config, the compute units, the TMU and the shader units are identical to the PS5, 2304, 2304, 144, 64, 36. 144, 64, 36. Okay, same deal, right? The teraflop rating here is actually a little bit higher because of how they compute this on this site. So notice they have 3 different clock speeds that they mention here: a base clock, a game clock, and then a boost clock. The way that they calculate the teraflops here, which is again the maximum theoretical performance, is based on the boost clock, which is here, which is higher than the PS5. The PS5 is 2.2, we saw it like 2.23. So it's a little bit lower than this, but it's a little bit higher than this game clock. Now, in reality, when you run a game on an AMD GPU, it spends most of the time running at around the game clock frequency, not the boost clock. The boost clock might be a burst for a very short period of time here and there, but that's how they calculate the theoretical performance. So it's not exactly apples to apples. The PS5 teraflop is rated based solely on this single GPU clock, this 2.2, right? So just keep that in mind. We really care about the game clock, but the numbers, everything that they show here is based on the boost clock, okay? So that's why the teraflop is a little bit higher. But this essentially is the PS5 GPU. Now, we can now look at this relative chart here just to get an idea of where this actually fits. Now, people have been talking about the PS5 forever being roughly a 2070 Super. Well, you see that there. This card is generally about 3%, it's obviously pretty much in the ballpark. The 6650 XT is also very much within the ballpark. And this is usually the other GPU that I go to kind of reference the PS5, because you will find the 6650 a lot more readily than you would the 6700. Now we have the new 7600, which is an RDNA 3 card from AMD, so it's part of their new line, 3%. So this is, again, if you had to look at RDNA 3, this is as close as you probably can get to what a PS5 would be, on the RDNA 3 side. But we're also within the ballpark of an RTX 4060, so that's kind of where the PS5 fits from NVIDIA's Ada series level, 4060. And then, going back to the 2000 series as well, the 2080 is only 4%. So you can say that, again, everything from the 2070 here all the way up to about the 2080 is within less than 5% within, what a PS5 equivalent GPU could be. So this is generally speaking kind of the ballpark of where the PS5 is, which is pretty decent, right? I mean, a 4060, even today, that's a decent level mid-range card, right? Entry to mid-range card. Now, what would it take and what would it look like to get our 2x increase? Well, let's kind of scroll down here. Let's keep going. 2080 Ti, 25%. 3070 Ti, 40%. You got a 6800, that's only 44%. Keep going. 3080, about 70%. 6900 XT is about 77%. 3080 Ti, if you guys can see that. Okay, actually should have done this earlier. I'm gonna zoom in a little bit here. But 3080 Ti, sorry, 6900 3080 Ti is here. That's 91%. Also, the 6950 from AMD. Now, this 6950 is the absolute top of the line card in RDNA 2, the RDNA 2 architecture series, right? This is as high as RDNA 2 can go. And you see, this is about 91%. Now, this is a relative performance. It's an estimate based on the specs, essentially. It's not actual real-world game performance, so this is an estimate. So I would say that this is close enough, right? 91%, which is in the ballpark of a 3090. Now, if you looked at my channel, looked at some of the early videos, I talked about the PS5 Pro. I had mentioned the dream, the idea that it was maybe feasible by the way that, AMD's roadmap was playing out with RDNA 3, that we could have seen an RTX 3090 level of performance in the PS5 Pro. So to me, this is kind of like the holy grail. This is probably the best case, that the ceiling of what we probably can get for a PS5 Pro. Is that possible? Well, maybe, right? As we can see, 6950 XT and a 3090 is roughly 2x. So if Sony is serious about that 2x, improvement, that's what we would be talking about. We would be talking about roughly a 3090, up to a 4070 Ti. Now, today, 4070 Ti is absolutely nothing to sneeze at, right? There's only two other cards from NVIDIA that's higher than that, the 4080 and, of course, the crazy 4090. But that actually gets us fairly within striking range of a 7900 XT. 7900 XT would still be quite a bit faster, but, that's what we're talking about. But generally speaking, 3090, 6950 is kind of like the upper end here. 3080 Ti and the 6900 XT, I think, is probably the lower bound of what we're talking about for it to be meaningful. Okay, like we want at least a 2x increase so that it's meaningful, I think, as a product. Otherwise, what's the point? That's probably the minimum. That's what that looks like. Okay, you guys follow me? So now the next question is that even feasible to get into a console by the end of 2024 for a relatively reasonable price and form factor? Now, to answer that question, you have to pay attention to my previous videos where I stressed the point. When you look at the console GPUs, especially on Sony side for the PlayStations, you only need to look at the mobile roadmap, AMD's mobile roadmap, to see what is actually feasible. Why do I say that? And I've already highlighted this and I've broken this down, but it's plain to see that the PS4 and the PS4 Pro, both of them, were literally direct derivatives of the mobile version of that GPU, okay, of whatever the top of the line GPU was at that time. People want to hate on the PS4 and said that, it was underpowered when it launched. And relative to the top end desktops, you can make that argument. But if you understand how this stuff works, you cannot put what the top of the line AMD card was at the time, a 7970. You couldn't fit that in no console. No way whatsoever. It was way too much power and way too big. But what they did have, they actually had a 7970 mobile card, which was based on the 7800 series cards of AMD at the time. That's typically how that works, because the mobile card has to be smaller and lower power. It's usually based on the one beneath it on the desktop side. So it was labeled 7970 on mobile, but it really was a 7800 based on the desktop card, if you follow what I'm saying there. That's all you need to do. It's almost an exact match, and I've highlighted this before, so I'm not going to retread that, okay? So when you look at this, rumors point to, I didn't mention this in this latest article, but rumors have pointed to the PS5 Pro being based on RDNA 3, which makes sense. RDNA 3 is already out. By the time the PS5 Pro comes out, RDNA 4 should be out or just about to come out. So there's actually rumors are suggesting that Sony is looking to take some pieces of RDNA 4. They won't be able to get a full RDNA 4 GPU in time, but they can take some pieces that they feel would be beneficial for the console and kind of create a hybrid of RDNA 3 and RDNA 4, which proverbially around the internet is being called RDNA 3.5, of course, right? But basically, it will be at least an RDNA 3 level card, okay? Now, what do we know about RDNA 3 today? I already highlighted the 50% increase in ray tracing performance, the 50% performance per watt. We also know that RDNA 3 does not have any IPC improvement over RDNA 2. So what that means is if you have an RDNA 3 card that has the exact same render configuration here, same number of compute units, let's say, same general, clock speeds, it would probably generally perform about the same, right? There's no IPC gains. Now, what will happen and how you get your improvements for RDNA 3 is, generally speaking, you can get a lot more performance per watt, which means you can clock it a lot higher and use less power than what you would in RDNA 2. So you could expect the clock speeds to be quite a bit higher than what they were on RDNA 2. That alone will get you a good amount of power. Again, I talked about the ray tracing increase, and then of course there are some other underneath the hood optimizations and better efficiencies, with the GPU architecture that will ultimately should give you more real world performance in games. Now, the other big thing about RDNA 3 has to do with how AMD computes the overall compute power in RDNA 3. To show this, let's go to an RDNA 3 card. So here we are. This is AMD's second top of the line card. This card is too big to fit in a console by the end of 2024 timeframe for sure. But it's a decent example. 7900 XT is, let's look at the configuration here just for kicks. So this is 84 compute units. So they've increased their compute count by quite a bit. The clock speed here is actually not that much higher. It's not rightly higher at all, actually, than what we would generally see. Notice they added a new clock. There's a shader clock now, and a game clock, and then a boost clock. So now, the interesting thing that I want to highlight here is this number, this teraflops. 51 teraflops. Now, again, without it having any IPC improvements, the 7900 XT should be fairly close to the 6900 XT, right? Right? Generally speaking, you would think. And if we go up here and look at the 6900, which I had, sorry, let me find it. Here we go. Now, remember this, 84 compute units, 51 teraflops. Notice that the 6900 XT has 80 compute units, not 84, but 80 compute units, but it only says it's 23 teraflops. Now, I want to really make this point clear, guys, because a lot of people misconstrue this stuff around the internet. I want you to see this. The 6900 XT is an RDNA 2 card. It's rated at 23 teraflops. It only has 4 less compute units, all right? And it's almost the same clock speed. It's not, the game clock is actually pretty darn close, almost identical, okay? Now, this should imply, if you look totally at this number, that the 7900 XT would be twice the performance, right? The 7900 XT, right, was 46 teraflops, I think it said, right? But look at this, guys. It shows it right here. And again, this is the estimate, but this is ballpark. You get the idea. The 7900 XT is only 25% faster than the 6900 XT, okay? And that makes sense when you look at it. It's like, okay, you added a few more compute units. You went from 80 to 84. Right, you added a little bit higher clock, game clock. You had a shader clock, right? Very, very little bit more there, and you added a faster memory clock, so the bandwidth was way higher if you saw. So let's go back there for a second. So the bandwidth is 80 gigabytes per second, so that's a nice bump. The shader clock and game clock are pretty much identical, but the teraflop is, I said 46. It's rated at 51. And you have 4 more compute units, but you only get 25% more power, guys, right? How is that happening? Why is that happening? This is important. The RDNA 3 architecture, and as well as NVIDIA's Ampere 3000 series and their Ada 4000 series cards, they all use a new way to compute the teraflops based on the fact that those new architectures, in theory, can actually execute 2 instructions per cycle. Historically, the previous architectures, RDNA 2 and Turing and stuff like that, on the NVIDIA side, can only do 1 operation per cycle. So now that they can do 2 operations per cycle, what that effectively means is, based on the equation for teraflops, you essentially can take the teraflop rating and multiply it by 2, and that's exactly what they're doing here. So all you guys need to know is these teraflop numbers are pretty meaningless. and kind of superbly inflated. And you can see that in the actual real world performance. The same thing happens on the NVIDIA side. You'll see 2 times the teraflop count and only like 30% faster real world performance. It doesn't mean anything. Now, if you wanted to look at the theoretical performance though and compare it to the RDNA 2, you have to look at this number and then divide it by 2. So in this case, we are looking at something that's closer to 26 teraflops in terms of actual real world performance, right? And if you look at the 6900 XT, its teraflop rating is 23. Now that makes a lot more sense, and that's more in line with what we're seeing, right? It's roughly, 15 to 20% faster, performance. It depends on other factors too. Again, the memory bandwidth was also faster on the RDNA 3 card. And again, there's going to be some other optimizations and efficiencies on RDNA 3 as well, right? So it's not going to be exactly linear to the teraflop rating, of course, but this is more in line with what we're seeing in real world, right? So that said, when we go back to looking at the RDNA 3 series, and we see what the 7900 is. So if the PS5 Pro is going to be based on an RDNA 3 card, what would it be based on? What would it look like? Well, this leak didn't show that I already looked at from Tom Henderson here, right? This one didn't mention it. But we have already heard that the PS5 Pro and Sony in general is generally targeting what will likely be AMD's RX 7800 level card. Now, how do we know that? Well, what this leak did show and mention was 60 compute units, right? Well, do we see an AMD card that has 60 compute units? We actually do. It hasn't released yet, but there is an upcoming RX 7800 from AMD, which, there's been a number of leaks already, performance leaks, and a bunch of details that already come out. The card was actually supposed to already have been out by like June of this year. Now it's looking like September. So Tech PowerUp actually has it in their database. It hasn't released yet. Let me refresh this page. Just make sure we get the latest and greatest. It hasn't released yet. Data on this page may change in the future. So again, this isn't final stuff, but the details and the spec is not final, but pretty darn reliable at this point because we've heard it from a number of places. Okay, so what does this card look like? Now this is again 7800. This will be the second to highest line from the 7900, which is the top of the line for RDNA 3 from AMD. 7900 XTX is the top line. 7900 XT is their second top line. And right now this will be the third. This will be a RX 7800. Okay, let's look at the specs. RDNA 3, we get that. What does the core configuration look like? 60 compute units, 3840 shader units, 576 100 gigabytes per second. What do we know about that? What does that mean? Guess what? It's 18 gigabytes per second effective. What did we see with the actual PS5 Pro leak? We said 60 compute units. We saw 18,000 MTS. The 18,000 MTS is essentially 18 gigabytes per second. That's the equivalent metric. I don't know why they define it that way, but that's the same thing. We saw that the PS5 did not use that. The PS5 was only 14 gigabytes effective, right, with a 1750 megahertz. So this 7800 card, based on what we know now, looks pretty darn close to almost exactly what the PS5 Pro rumors and leaks are suggesting. Everything to the actual memory speed. So this bandwidth increase goes up from 448, okay, up to 576. That's a nice increase for a Pro. This isn't a new generation. This isn't a PS6. That's a nice bump. You're going to want more bandwidth if you have a bigger GPU and a faster GPU for sure. Okay, so 60 compute units, we get all of that, right? Now, the interesting thing here is the clock speed. I'll talk about this a little bit more. But needless to say, the actual game clock here is clocked quite a bit higher than even the PS5 is now, right? That 2.23. It's quite a bit higher. But more importantly, I talked about the performance per watt. So if you look at the 7800 here, okay, this core configuration should be pretty darn close to the 6800 from RDNA 2. Remember, there's no IPC, there's no instruction for clock improvement here, right? So where do we get the improvement? Why is it that the 6800 is so far beneath it here, right? Well, let's look at the 6800 for a second, guys. Just bear with me for a second. So if we go back here, I just want to highlight something. Again, we see the same thing here. 60 compute units. Okay, it's the same core config here. Obviously, the memory is the same bus. It's a little bit slower here, right? It's 16 gigabytes per second effective versus 18. That's why you got a little bit less bandwidth. But the core config is the same. The size of the actual GPU is the same. The difference here is going to be in the clock speeds. Now, that extra performance per watt means that you can clock RDNA 3 higher, right? Given the same size, die size, the same number space that you can fit, you can get more higher clocks. And that's what you see here. The game clock for the 6800 is only 1815 megahertz, right? Whereas we're looking at rumors still, but rumors suggest that this could be clocked as high as 2600. That's a big increase in clock speed. And that's where you essentially get your performance gain, right? That's the difference here. Okay, now, that said, let's say that the PS5 Pro is in fact 60 compute units. For the sake of argument, I mentioned how Sony will probably cut some of those out and disable them for yield's sake. Let's assume that they actually leave it completely enabled. The question now is, if this card looks really, really strikingly like the PS5 Pro level hardware that Sony is targeting, is it really hitting the 2x? Does that get us there? And the second question, is it actually feasible in a console? Because we know that this is a desktop card, and the desktop card is not feasible in a console. How do we know that? All we got to do is look at the actual power TDP, which is right here. 300 watts. 300 watts just for the GPU? Can we fit that in a console? This is not rocket science, guys. Let's take a look. What is the TDP for the PS5 right now? Now, this says PS5 GPU, but what this number shows here, down here, is 180 watts. What this doesn't specify, though, that I can tell you guys, is this 180 watts is the entire system, not just the GPU. The entire system. We have a GPU, we have a CPU, we have memory, we have an SSD drive, we have a bunch of dedicated hardware with the I/O controller and the decompression blocks, etc., etc. We have a disk drive for the disk version. All of that stuff uses power, right? So the entire system together is targeting about a TDP watt. We also know from experience now, the PS5 has been out for 3 years, that in practice, in the real world, PS5, when it's running a game, can hit about 200 watts. Yeah, about 200 watts. In some rare cases, it might be a little bit above 200 watts. But that's the total system. So we're looking at and again, look at the 6700, the PC equivalent, right? The TDP is 175 watts. We know that's just the GPU. So even though this card on paper is pretty darn close to a PS5, even to the game clock being pretty close to that 2.2 gigahertz, the PS5 GPU obviously still has some customization, some modification, some things stripped out in order for it to be even lower power, okay? Because that PS5 GPU is only using at most about maybe 130 watts of that total system power. CPU obviously usually only uses about 25, 30 watts. And all the other stuff on there, only uses, a little bit of watts, maybe another 30 watts or so. So that's how you get to that, roughly 200 watt range in the worst case. But the GPU has to be generally under 130 watts for it to fit in a console. So this 6700 couldn't fit directly, right? But with some modifications and optimizations, that's what they did for the PS5, right? So could a 7800 fit in a console? 300 watt TDP? Absolutely not. You would need to reduce this by roughly half somehow, right? Whether it's clock speed, whether it's, compute units, something has to give, right, to get this power down. Well, we do have a piece of information. This is still leaks and rumors, but this came out back in June from notebookcheck.net, caught it. So there was some rumors on the mobile RDNA 3 kind of roadmap in cards. Now, right now, the only mobile cards we know about for RDNA 3 are the really, really low end stuff, the 7600, 7700 level stuff. We would need something bigger than that for a PS5 Pro. Is there a 60 CU card on the mobile roadmap that can indicate that we can have a console equivalent? You guys might have already read ahead. There absolutely is. The mobile version of the RX 7600M, that's the M stands for mobile, XT, is a 60 compute unit card with 16 gigs of RAM, just like the PS5 has. and it's fitting into 165 watt TDP. That's noticeably lower than the 300 watt TDP we see for the desktop card, right? So AMD is already working on this. All we need to know from this is they have it on the roadmap. It's seemingly possible. Now, if we look a little bit closer, there's a number of cards that showed up in this leak. The 7800M is on the top range. It says 16 CU, 16 gigs, 165 watts. But also, sorry guys, I didn't mean to click that. Look down here. There's a 7900, geez, didn't keep it clicking Twitter, sorry. There's a 7900S. The S is usually means like ultra low power. It's their ultra low power version, right? To usually fit into a laptop or something like that. Or like an ultra low power, like a thin book or something. They have one that has 60 CUs here as well. And even though the overall specs look the same, look at the power difference. We have one that's down to 135 watts. So guys, what is possible for AMD? This is this year. By the end of next year, can they get a 60 CU mobile card down to that 130 watt range for a console? They absolutely can. It's already in the roadmap. We've already seen it. Now, this isn't finalized. This isn't official. The name might be different. There may be differences with the actual final power. We'll see. But just the fact that this even exists shows that it is possible, and it should be possible by the end of next year. 60 CUs in a mobile form factor with roughly 130 watts, 135 watts. That's what we're looking at. Notice that the 60 CU part is the largest. It's the biggest part here. So anyone dreaming of a 72 CU, 80 CU, we're not going to see that. Right? Because it's just not going to happen in that time frame for any reasonable price. Okay? But it's there. So with that in mind, let's go back here. If that's the case, maybe this 60 CU rumor may have some credence to it, right? Does that get us to the 2X? Well, we talked about that, right? The 2X ideally was pretty much a 6950. That was 91% ahead of what the proverbial 6700, right? We were right here. 91% from that. 3090, 3080 Ti, that's the range. Where is this 7800 card falling right now? You see it. It literally is right in between a 6900 XT and a 6950 XT. Is 4% under the 6950 XT. That's obviously within the ballpark. 3080 Ti as well, 4%. Is literally in between. So this, now again, there's going to be other optimizations and improvements in the RDNA 3 architecture itself that should get better performance. We're going to get a much more ray tracing performance as well. So this gets us in the ballpark, right? Now, the teraflops here is 43. Again, you got to take that number, this is RDNA 3, divided by 2 to kind of give you a comparison point versus RDNA 2 that's already in the PS5. And you see, you get about 21 teraflops with this configuration. So on paper, there you go. That's your 2X from your 10 teraflops today, right? Again, grain of salt with the relative performance here. This is still very much like theoretical and experimental. But on paper, we know a lot of these details already. The actual core config. We don't know the final clock speed, but if it's going to be this is what the rumors say now, this will get us to about 21 teraflops, which on paper again will give you 2X. In actual performance, theoretical performance, it still gets us in that ballpark. We're within 5%, right, of the 6950 top of the line RDNA 2 card, right? That's pretty amazing, actually, right? And again, we're like within 6% of a 3090. Now, the big question here is what will Sony actually clock this thing at? There's no way to know that. But I want to point out something again, right? This teraflop number and this relative performance is again based on this boost clock of 2800. So this is an absolute best case, guys. This is assuming that they keep all 60 CUs active, which they probably won't, and that somehow they can actually get the core game clock on the PS5 Pro to hit 2.8. It's not impossible, given that they already have 2.2 going in the PS5. It's not impossible, but that seems a little bit high. I'm thinking it probably would be more closer to the 2600 mark, which in theory would reduce these numbers down, and it probably would wind up being like the actual PS5 Pro version of this. If you cut out, let's say 4 CUs for yields, you only clock to 2600, which is still a nice boost over the current PS5. But that'll bring all of this stuff down a little bit, right? And the performance will probably be more in line of a 6900 XT on paper. But we need to see. the point here, guys, if you follow, and I think I broke this down pretty well and clear, all I'm trying to say is this is what's realistically feasible now. 60 CUs is feasible. We see it's on the roadmap. We see that AMD has mobile cards that are coming with that same core config. We see what this 7800 desktop card pretty much looks like on paper, and it pretty much matches the rumors for the PS5 Pro. So all of this stuff is pointing to the same place. And I think this is, again, you can disregard everything I'm saying, but don't act like you're surprised. Don't act like you didn't hear it here, all right? Because when this thing is announced and, really coming to market, if it's true that they're already showing demos and dev kits are going to be out in a few months, really later this year, we're going to hear about this probably early in 2024. And when we do, you should not be surprised when we look at the power envelope that it's generally speaking going to be on the matching the top level cards for RDNA 2, 6900, 6950. It's going to be in that ballpark. And it's going to be in the ballpark of a 3080 Ti. It should be noticeably ahead of a 3080. Again, for reference, the 3080 just isn't a big enough bump overall. It's 70%. That's just not enough, I don't think, for it to be a meaningful product. They really want to hit that 2x mark. So they got to get close to a 3080 Ti. And I think they will. You got to see what they do with the configuration and the clock speeds, but hopefully you see that this is actually feasible. Now, of course, there are other people that there was other rumors that came out, I think, like a week or two ago. This was kind of floating on the internet where these updated PS5 Pro specs were published that point to a much more powerful machine. This isn't going to happen. They talk about a CPU being Zen 4. That may happen. 4.2 gigahertz variable. That's not going to happen. Too much power, too much heat. Coming from 3.5, I don't think we'll see that much of a bump on the CPU side. Going to Zen 4 alone is going to be a big deal. I don't think it'll hit 4.2. It may go up to like 3.8. It'll be amazing if it can get it to maybe 4.0, but yeah, I don't see this happening. And look at the GPU, 72 CU, pipe dream, 2.5. They show it did go up, but not by that much. You still wind up getting almost to the same area. They're talking about 23 teraflop. That's a RDNA 2 equivalent power. So this configuration, of course, would have a 2x. You just do it with a bigger GPU. The reason why they're saying this, though, is because the PS4 Pro was essentially like a butterfly. It was basically taking the PS4 GPU and multiplying it by 2 in a butterfly fashion. So you went from 18 to 36. So the idea is that you go from 36 to 72 if you did the same thing, if Sony decided to do the same thing. I don't know. Maybe they might. Maybe the 60 CU thing is just pure rumor and is wrong. Again, there's a lot of things pointing to that 60 CU, and we see that on the mobile roadmap. That gives you extra credence for me. But maybe Sony is trying to just double it up again, and they go 72 CU. So it may be a little bit less variable. And if they can hit the 23 teraflop mark, you definitely got your 2x. You'll have more than 2x and more than 2.5x increase for ray tracing. This would be awesome. Now, where this really gets into pipe dream territory is the RAM and the bandwidth. 780 from 448, no way. No way. The 576 is much more realistic. You're not going to see that level of an increase. You're not going to see basically a whole bit bus increase. Typically not for a Pro or, just like an iterative hardware jump. I would love to see 20 gigs of RAM. I don't think they will do that again. They might add a little bit extra RAM for the OS, but I think we're going to see still 16 gigs of GDDR6 RAM. So that's where this really kind of jumps the shark, so to speak. And I don't see this happening at all. But some people think this might be, this will be a crazy, a killer system for sure. I don't see it. And I don't think we really need it. 20 teraflops, hitting that would be awesome. They can probably do that with high clock, 60 CU system. 3.8-ish for the CPU with Zen 4 would be an awesome increase on the CPU side. 576 would be a nice bump there. I would love for them to be able to get 20 gigs of RAM and go from 16 to 20. I don't see it, but, we'll see. But anyway, that's all for now. That's kind of what the rumors are saying. I wanted to highlight, talk about it. Again, you should not be surprised. This isn't rocket science, guys. I think I'm laying it out pretty clear of what is feasible. You cannot get a 4090, 4080, even a 7900 XT into a console with a roughly $500 price point by the end of 2024. It's just not going to happen. So you might say, oh, why only 2x improvement? Well, again, you saw, right? Moore's law is dead. We don't see 2x improvement every 18 months like we once did. You know, in fact, 2 years. I mean, guys, let's do a little quick experiment just for kicks. I want you guys to see what 3080 was. Okay, 3080 was Ampere. That was one generation, right? When Ada came out, we went to the 4080. How much more powerful was the 4080? You see it here, roughly 50%. The 4080 came out 2 years later. That's where we're at now. This is Moore's law, right? It was 18 months, a year and a half, you might see double. Now it's 24 months, 2 years, you might be lucky to see 50%, not even like half of double, right? That's the reality. So we're just going to be seeing more incremental power increases as time goes on. You know, by the end of 2024, it would have been 4 years. 4 years. So that actually adds up pretty darn well when you think about it, right? If every 2 years we see a 50% bump, in 4 years, we double. And that's exactly that's the reality of the world we live in today, guys. If you understand that, it works out perfectly. The math works out perfectly. 2024, 4 years removed from the PS5 launch, we're able to double our GPU performance and maybe get a roughly 50% increase in CPU performance, because the CPU usually doesn't have as big of a jump anyway. That's where we're at, all right? Even looking at the 3090 to the 4090, 4090 was so amazingly powerful when it came out, and it is even higher, but it's still only 66%. That's a nice bump, but it's not double. It's not double a 3090, no way. Now you could try to add, you know, frame gen. That's other stuff. That's software. Who knows what can happen with that? But just looking at the raw hardware and transistors, the days of double, you know, performance gen on gen is gone. We need about 2 gens to double performance now. That's just a reality, and that's kind of why we need a PS5 Pro, I would say, because another 4 years, by 2028, when we talk about theoretically a PS6 or whatever, we might only be about, you know, 4 to 5 times the power of a PS5 at that point. You know, like realistically, right? It might just be 4 or 5 times. That's it. Unless something radical happens, who knows? But you know, that could be all we're looking at in 8 years. So it would be nice to have a stopgap so we can, you know, close the gap a little bit. And of course, if you know we do see a, you know, roughly 700-800 level, whatever that looks like, you know, we now move, the PS5 Pro would have moved way up this chart here, right? To be in the ballpark of a 3090, 6950. That's still pretty top stuff, right? So anyway, that's where we're at. Hopefully this makes sense. Hopefully you enjoyed this content. Sorry, you know, for going as long as I did, but if you made it this far, I really, really appreciate you. Continue to support. I'll continue making the videos. Look out for the PS5 Pro. We'll hear a lot more about it soon. I will keep you guys posted, but hopefully we'll see you next year. Till then, till next video, True Techno Gamer, signing off.